Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer J.J. Bonella here with Drew Conry-Murray, and we have a really juicy, I say that every time, but we do have a juicy news roundup for you, looking back into early July as we're recording now and throughout parts of June. Some of the things we're talking about are going to be scattered spider and their pretty advanced social engineering tactics and the different industries that they're targeting, including some new things happening just today as we're recording. We've got big changes in the Microsoft operating system and Windows after that 2024 CrowdStrike debacle where we took down millions of systems across the world.
Well, we didn't.
we, the industry,
okay.
Our failures collectively as professionals.
The royal we.
Royal we, yes, we. Drew and I are also going to talk about how to not hire a North Korean accidentally, as well as some major shifts in ransomware tactics, why we're seeing less encryption and just more ransom.
Yeah, we're also going to be talking about a 23andMe lawsuit, what it means for you. 23andMe is a now defunct DNA testing company. Why some countries are thinking about dumping Microsoft and what might replace it. We'll dig into a Google Cloud outage from mid-June, a lawsuit launched by Disney and Universal against an AI company, and bizarre critical vulnerabilities in popular printers. So all right, let's dive right in. First, Scattered Spider, that's a hacking group, also known as the less exciting UNC 3944. It's going after managed service providers and IT vendors in an effort to penetrate customers served by those providers. There's a story in Cybersecurity Dive where it says the criminal group is using social engineering techniques to gain access to targets, and that includes like calling up customer support or help desk and asking for password resets or trying to get privileged access or even request new MFA devices. And the security researcher ReliaQuest says the attackers will often pose as executives or senior employees as part of their social engineering package.
Yeah, so Scattered Spider is one of the groups, I would say one of the ones that spun up after, what was the other ransomware gang that got taken down several months ago? But the interesting and terrifying, I guess, is they do target native English-speaking organizations, typically North America and then parts of Europe. Their social engineering tactics are very sophisticated. It's not like, somebody with some bizarre accent calling you or, typoed emails pretending to be somebody else. They're really good at what they do. They are manipulative and they are employing all kinds of tactics. And, some of this stuff has escalated, but what they've, I guess, been known for in the past several months is this is the group that hit all the retailers across the UK back in, I think that was like April into May. They focused their attention then on the insurance segment. That's where Aflac got hit, among some others. Then they kind of started coming off after the tech companies and managed service and managed security services providers. So I think that's a lot of us, whether we are in that space or we're consuming those services.
Mm-hmm.
So we're being targeted. And then just in the past couple of days, we've had warnings about Scattered Spider targeting airlines. And the airline industry, we've already seen stuff from Hawaiian Air. And I think just today at the beginning of July, we're recording July 2nd, Qantas Air was hit as well. Oh, and Clorox, if you guys remember the big, Clorox breach a couple years ago. So this is a sophisticated group. They moved quickly. They're very financially motivated. And I've even had to send, as advisory CISO, internal notes company-wide saying basically, be on the lookout for this type of behavior. If you see anything suspicious, let's talk about it. Kind of, don't just assume. So that's happening and it's a little bit terrifying.
Is their modus operandi ransomware? Is that where they're making the money?
Yeah, extortion.
Extortion. Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I don't know the mix of, how much of it is actually encryption, encrypting devices to get ransomware, to get payments, or just straight up extortion. But they're definitely financially motivated. It does look like we'll talk about a story coming up about, some of the tactics that are changing here. I think they're using whatever is quick and gets them money the fastest. So I think it's combinations of those things.
I guess I'm sort of constantly amazed that social engineering continues to be such a valuable technique, or maybe I shouldn't be amazed based on the state of humanity, but yeah, it's effective.
It really is. And I mean, it's so hard to prevent against it. So we've got this really great write-up by Google in the show notes. Their threat intelligence team has a lot of proactive hardening recommendations that are very specific depending on your architecture. They've got stuff that's specific for Google, stuff that's specific for Microsoft with links and details about what you should configure for each kind of what I would call protect surface or asset surface, like, networking, users, identity, et cetera. It's kind of long, but it's very bulleted. Like it's organized well. It's easy to follow. It's easy to kind of go down and make it a checklist. So definitely check that out under the Google Threat Intelligence.
Moving on, Microsoft has announced a new Windows Resiliency initiative to make Windows less prone to outages and more secure. And one of the first steps of that initiative is that third-party AV and endpoint protection providers will be able to run security products in user mode, that is, outside of the Windows kernel. A Microsoft blog says this change will, quote, help security developers provide a high level of reliability and easier recovery, resulting in less impact on Windows devices in the event of unexpected issues. And all of that, I think, is a cloaked way of saying we won't have another CrowdStrike. So if you recall the CrowdStrike issue, that was tied to, a buggy update that CrowdStrike released. And because CrowdStrike did have access to the Windows kernel, the bad bug got into the boot of the device and then just shut down Windows servers and Windows devices, millions of them, which then caused outages at airlines, banks, hotels, manufacturing, and other businesses. So Microsoft now trying to be like, yeah, maybe we don't need to give everybody access to the kernel.
I think that's an interesting approach. It's not unique, but it's an interesting approach. That outage was almost exactly a year ago. It was in July of last year. And it was 8.5 million devices. If you guys remember, because we were in the middle of, some of the summer travel, a lot of the airlines had extensive outages because of this. And it did require hands-on keyboards a lot of times because of the recovery mechanisms. So if you guys have listened to the podcast, I come from infrastructure. I know nothing about, like systems and platforms, operating systems. And, I've heard tidbits. I'd love to actually have a guest on and talk about the debate about, in the kernel and not. I've heard this argued a few different ways. I've heard it argued, okay, well, I think I might get this wrong. You guys will probably write in and tell me I'm wrong. That's fine. I think, Apple is one of those examples of you don't get that deeply embedded. However, I've read some arguments for the case that doesn't translate to Windows because of the open and interoperability of the platform. And you don't have, big brother Apple watching things for you on your behalf and locking things down other places. You have a more open, integrated ecosystem of this tooling when you're on Windows and, other platforms. So I don't know how the rest of like Linux and everybody else works with this, but I think that's an interesting conversation to, explore what does that mean? Because what I've heard, and again, this is out of ignorance on my part, but what I've heard is you can't get the same level of security, visibility, and control if you're not in the kernel.
So my understanding is that one of the reasons that Windows was granting kernel access to a select group of security vendors is because Microsoft also offers a security product. And the third-party vendors were like, well, if Microsoft gives its own security product access to the kernel, that gives it a competitive advantage over our security products. And there was an EU ruling that said, okay, Microsoft, if you're going to give your own security product access to the kernel, competitors in the security space also need that access. And so Microsoft was complying with that ruling. And Microsoft said it did it, grudgingly, and that something bad would happen. And now they're pointing to this like, see, we told you. What I understand about, things like rootkits and those kind of threats is that you do need kernel visibility if you're going to be able to detect those. So it seems like Microsoft, some of the articles I read about this, Microsoft is trying to figure out a way to get some kind of API access to a limited set of the kernel without giving full kernel access. One, I think, to walk that line with these EU requirements, and two, provide some kernel visibility that is useful to security companies while also falling in line with those EU requirements that everybody gets the same kind of access.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting because I think if they kick everybody out of the kernel, that could fundamentally change endpoint security as we know it and use it in the Windows, ecosystem now. But this Windows Resilience Initiative, WRI, actually includes 4 focus areas. So they talk about strength and reliability based on the incident with CrowdStrike that we saw in July. The other couple of interesting things, though, were about enabling more apps and users to run without having admin privileges. And I think that's an interesting kind of twist on this as well, because I think one of the challenges, it's crazy, like the organizations, that I consult with are kind of all industries and, mid-market up through enterprise. And it's really interesting because some of them have a very hard line of user thou shalt not ever have admin privileges. And then there are other organizations that are much more loosey-goosey and open with that. And they do let their users have admin privileges and they have other controls in place. But regardless of which way you do it, I think that users having to have admin privileges to do, basic things, make certain common system changes that are just user-based and or install applications, like that's been a hard nut to crack because it's been sort of all or nothing. So
right.
The idea that maybe we could have this gray area of give them a little bit more control without exposing the platform to risk, I think that's interesting.
It also looks like they're trying to look at stronger controls for what apps and drivers are actually allowed to run, and then improved identity protection to minimize phishing attacks.
Yeah.
Those all seem like good ideas to me.
Absolutely. So I think this is really going to be interesting. So some of the things that we're talking about here are in like, I think, preview mode coming in July. There are, I think, some other things that they announced around the same time that are going to come later in the year. So I think they're in that period of like working with all of the security vendors that are plugging into their operating system so that everybody can kind of, kick the wheels a little bit and understand what they can and can't do. There was also some mention around this. So we'll put all the links in the show notes here. So they also talk about like Windows recovery environments and doing a quick machine recovery function to get machines back up. So that whole last year hands-on keyboard for recovery, they're putting some things in place, I think, that almost like we have with some infrastructure where it's like, do this config. And then if you can't connect to certain things, you need to revert to your prior config and then restart. So it sounds like that's what they're doing with this quick machine recovery. A few other interesting things is they have something called connected cache coming out, which sounded to me like just patching servers like we used to have that were on-prem. Some auto patching coming out for Windows 11, certain versions of Windows 11, which are going to be hot patches that you don't have to reboot with. So I think that's pretty interesting.
Okay.
That could be cool. And then one that kind of made me raise an eyebrow, because part of me is like, oh, this sounds cool. And then part of me is like, well, this sounds like a horrible idea if it's not protected. And this is this Microsoft 365, I think it's called Reserve. So it's kind of this on-demand virtual desktop that's hosted in the cloud. And it sounds like what it is if a user has a computer that's like lost, stolen, or they don't have physical access to it, maybe you went on vacation and you were going somewhere and you didn't take your laptop, or you're going to a country you couldn't take your laptop. It sounds like this is like you can dynamically spin up this virtual desktop with your user profiles in the cloud. And use it through some, I guess, web interface. I don't know, but that's also coming. So I would say lots of security considerations happening in the Windows ecosystem in the next 6 months or so.
Yeah, and links in the show notes. And as JJ mentioned, I think we'd love to have a good conversation about applications in user space and kernel space and what all that means. So if that's you, raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you, packetpushers.net/FU. Moving on, the U.S. Justice Department has filed indictments against U.S. nationals accused of stealing identities and hosting laptop farms to enable North Korean workers to gain employment at more than 100 U.S. companies over a 3-year period. The indictment says U.S. victim companies incurred damages and losses of at least $3 million related to the schemes. Defrauded businesses include Fortune 500 companies and a U.S. defense contractor.
They done been fraudulating people, y'all. Oh, sorry. Okay, so you went down the indictment rabbit hole. I went down a different rabbit hole a little bit with kind of like what they're doing and how they're doing it. So there was an interesting story in one of them, and it was saying it like a few years ago, and I think it was like 2020, there was actually a cryptocurrency firm that hired a developer they found on Telegram. I don't know why you're hiring people on Telegram, but YOLO, whatever.
I'm not surprised it was a crypto firm, I'll say that.
Drew's shaking his head and literally scratching his head on this one. But apparently this person, they said, gained trust and eventually became the CTO, so the chief technology officer of the cryptocurrency company.
Wow.
Siphoned off about $500,000. That firm's founder got suspicious in the 12 months or so after hiring this person and eventually contacted the FBI. So this all happened a few years ago. Just like this week, or maybe it was last week, the FBI kind of announced that they dug into this and was actually a North Korean operative that had gotten into this firm.
So got hired over Telegram, did such a good job, they eventually became CTO, and they were a North Korean operative the whole time. Wow.
Yep. But I did find an interesting quote. I think in one of the Ian's research reports about this, they pulled a quote from an article where somebody at Google was saying, that they've talked to a lot of Fortune 500 CISOs, and nearly every one of them has admitted that they've, accidentally hired at least one North Korean IT worker at some point. But they did. And, we covered it several weeks ago, or I guess a few months ago. This almost happened. Well, no, it did happen to know before, but they had so many security controls and monitoring in place that they caught it very, very quickly. So, interesting takeaways from that. One of the other things I've seen and heard very recently is, well, I heard about it recently, I'm sure they've been doing it for a while, is that a lot of these, bad actors and North Korean, operatives, some of the things that they do is they'll actually post fake job descriptions for the things that they plan to apply for so that they can get resumes to model their fake resumes after and get the right people that have the skills, right?
So you could be doing due diligence saying, okay, they say they did this at this company. I will go look that up and be like, oh yeah, there was this job at this company.
Well, no, like they're posting fake job openings. So they'll go, hey, I'm, Acme Gizmo crypto, whatever, and we're looking for developers.
Oh, I see, I see, I see. Okay, uh-huh. And then they copy the resumes to give to their fake workers to say, use this resume. Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so they model their resumes off of that. So they're just harvesting actuals, resumes and CVs, maybe even conducting interviews to see, questions that get asked and how people respond to those questions to train their teams on how to be successful and for them to go find the right people when they are then applying for those jobs.
Wow. Okay. So prepared. They're very prepared.
Yeah.
I realize this is a problem. And aside from the crime, though, I'd love to see the performance reviews on these North Korean workers. Like, are they actually good at their jobs? Because in this one case, at least, it sounds like they were. The guy got to be CTO.
Yeah, I mean, that's the crappy part is they're actually good at their jobs. But, they're not there for you. They're there for the North Korean government. They're going to find a way to steal money or intellectual property that they can, sell for money or extort you for money with. And yeah, it's a bad time all around. But, in the absence of that, yeah, they would be great workers. So it's a shame.
I also think there is a business idea here for someone of, questionable moral fiber, like a service that like trains foreigners to be conversant in sort of US cultural things, because sometimes like cultural things could send up a red flag or cause an alarm. Like, why did they say that?
Yeah.
So, something to think about.
Yeah.
Did you ever see the TV show, The IT Crowd?
No. Do I need to put that on the list?
Well, there's an example here that's sort of germane. There's a couple of guys there who are IT folks and they're very nerdy, but they want to fit in with other people who like sports. And they find this website that gives them like prepackaged phrases they can use so they sound like they know what they're talking about English football.
Oh, goodness.
Something like that.
Sports ball.
Sports ball, yes. But something like that for
Sports
these poor
ball.
North Koreans who are like, what the hell is a Dallas Cowboy? What do I need to know about that?
They're cheerleaders. That's all you need to know.
All right, moving on, there's a new Sophos report on ransomware attacks that has found a 20% decrease in the use of encryption as part of that ransomware attack, with extortion-only attacks on the rise. Sophos is speculating that one reason for the decline in encryption may be that companies are getting better at stopping attacks before the encryption payload is deployed.
I will say, though, that the other flip side of this, they and a couple of other research firms have also identified that there is a trend of a decrease in an attempt to encrypt files as part of ransomware. And in certain size organizations, they're just going straight for extortion.
Okay, meaning we got your data, we'll leak it if you don't give us X amount of money?
Yep.
Okay, so we don't need to encrypt it. We're just going to threaten you with leakage.
Yeah, because if you think about it, really, if I were a malicious actor personally, I'm all about operational efficiency. I am. If encrypting somebody's stuff is not going to impact their business enough that they're going to pay you. Let's back up for a second. We were talking about, scattered spider and hitting the retail industry, especially in the UK several weeks ago, and like the company that owns Victoria's Secret, et cetera. To not allow their users or their customers to come online and to buy stuff is an immediate loss, right? Financial loss. So an organization of that size and that type would probably be more willing to pay a ransom to get stuff decrypted and or pay to prevent extortion if there's like, financial data at stake or something. But if you have an organization where it's like, oh, if you hit our website or you hit this or you hit that, we can still keep operating and it's a minimal blip, I'm not going to pay you millions of dollars for ransom or even, hundreds of thousands of dollars for ransom. So why even go through that exercise? Yeah, we talked to, Jake.
Oh yeah, Malware Jake.
Malware Jake about, kind of the ecosystem and the economy of malware and ransomware and, how these different threat actors, it's not one threat actor that finds a target, sneaks in or kicks down the door, plants malicious code there and then, executes the rest of that chain. They're actually hiring out different pieces of that, or contracting out different pieces of that, or using other people's tools that are licensed for different pieces of that. So if you just cut your expenses, if you think you're not going to get that money anyway, and you just go for the extortion piece of it, that is quite efficient.
And when you, make your quarterly report to your bosses, you can be like, we drove efficiency by removing encryption as a part of our ransomware scheme.
That's what I would do. That's what I would do. Because,
there you go.
There's lots of places for that to go sideways because you maybe you paid for that, you're licensing that, so it's more of an expense. You've involved another entity in that. It may or may not work depending on the tooling and the mitigation and endpoint security, et cetera. With other things that are, I would say, lots of organizations that are very, cloud first and SaaS based. This whole lateral movement and getting in through an infrastructure through like endpoint and pivoting into, an Active Directory domain infrastructure and then, kind of escalating up. that may not be possible in certain organizations. And so then it's how do we get to the data and how do we steal that data?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I guess it makes sense. If you can get money more efficiently, why wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm.
Sophos also notes that exploited vulnerabilities remain the top root cause of ransomware attacks at 32%, with compromised credentials the second biggest cause at 23%.
Yeah, that's the Sophos take on. I think it's interesting because the endpoint security vendors use different measurements here.
Mm-hmm.
And other third-party researchers tend to have that flipped so that it's, I would say most of the industry recognizes compromised credentials as the primary root cause for a lot of these, and other things are, secondary.
Right.
But it depends on, which lens you're looking through. But they did say, so some of the numbers I think everybody did agree on is that this year, only half of the ransomware attacks involved data encryption. Last year was about 70%. So that's a 20% drop.
It's a big drop. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it sounded like Sophos was trying to make it sound like that organizations are better at preventing the explosion of that encryption payload, but maybe it's just that, as you say, the malware actors are deciding not to bother. So less hooray for us.
Yeah, I think it's both, a little bit of both.
Could be a little both. We'll have links to that Sophos report if you want to check it out. Moving on, the DNA testing company 23andMe, which filed for bankruptcy, has been sold to a nonprofit company started by 23andMe co-founder and CEO Anna Wojcicki. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
I don't know.
That nonprofit paid $305 million to pick up the company she used to run. Like, wow, I don't know how that... Anyway, so the issue around 23andMe is it is a DNA testing company. Consumers swabbed some saliva, sent it in, and got a DNA report. But this company also has that data, and there were privacy concerns about would this be sold off to who knows who in a bankruptcy sale. So now it's going to this nonprofit being run by the original co-founder of 23andMe.
Yeah. So the new nonprofit is called TTAM, which is the acronym of the letters of 23andMe. So kind of cute. This whole thing is just we're giggling. It's just a little bit interesting and twisty. I do think it's an important case to follow. There were two organizations, bidding once 23andMe filed bankruptcy. There's some other weird stuff that happened leading up to that. And last year, it sounded like the whole executive suite under, what was her name, Anna
Wojcicki.
Wojcicki, just kind of like they left en masse at the end of last year,
Yep.
citing her leadership specifically. So I don't, I know nothing about these people or what the dispute was. So I'm not taking sides on this at all, but that's interesting. But so I think the US, court system appointed, I don't know how this works, an ombudsman. I had to Google this.
Yes, ombudsman. Uh-huh.
Yes. So that person, I think his name was Neil something, is kind of writing a report basically saying, look, so this is a kind of a neutral third party looking at everything in the verbiage and the language and the terms and conditions and the sale and deciding whether we, whoever used 23andMe, and I'm going to put an asterisk there because it's not just the people that use 23andMe, but the people that use 23andMe, the argument is that they didn't agree at the time that they signed up for their data to be sold.
Right.
And it's not just like, your address and whether you were subscribed to, Sportsman Fishing Magazine or whatever.
Right.
It's your DNA, which is, like mostly immutable, but it also extends beyond you because your DNA connects you to other people and other people's DNA is connected to you up and down, your family tree. So it does not just impact the user. So the argument is, look, this is something, no take backsies here. You can't just change your DNA like you could a password or something else. And the then customers or the prior customers have a right to, opt in or out of their data being sold. So I think this is interesting. And I don't know that they've hit a resolution with that yet. It sounded like the interim 23andMe CEO. So after Ann, this other gentleman that was CEO just blatantly said, he was not agreeing to protect the users, data, privacy, and information.
Sure. I mean, the majority of the value that company had was DNA data on customers. So, yeah.
It does sound like this nonprofit started by the original 23andMe co-founder and CEO is willing to honor whatever those original terms and conditions were. I don't know what all was in there, but lots of twisty stuff going on in here. They changed the terms after they filed for bankruptcy, but that was after people had already opted into the terms that were originally there. So I think this is going to set a precedent, obviously not a lawyer here, but I think this is going to set a precedent for, privacy and our rights, especially in America, to be forgotten and to not have our personal data sold this way.
That would be great. I hope that is so.
That would be great. Oh, wow.
Yeah, we can hope. So the Danish government has announced plans to migrate from Microsoft products to LibreOffice. That's a suite of free open source software, including things like documents, spreadsheets, and slides. The move's driven by the notion of digital sovereignty. That's an effort by some countries in the EU to reduce dependence on foreign, i.e. primarily US, technology, as well as exercise more control over data on European citizens and businesses.
Yeah, this is a trend in Europe. So this is not new. This particular story came out of Denmark. So this whole digital sovereignty here. I think Germany has pursued this already to some degree ahead of this. One of the stories, because I was kind of curious and I go down rabbit holes, as Drew knows. So I started poking around in here. One of the stories kind of caught my attention because I thought, I think we all like to think, for those of you listening, if we live in the US, we think we're the good guys, at least normally.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of thought, well, I wonder what drove this, because I feel like there had to be some prior either inciting incident or trend.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the examples was that there was let me read it here. It says, after the EU-based International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister for war crimes, President Donald Trump issued ICC sanctions. This order allegedly prompted Microsoft to lock the ICC's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, out of his email accounts, according to reports. So now, I'm not going to keep reading, further down that there's some dispute where, supposedly Microsoft's claiming they didn't do it, but they're offering no statement and no explanation of why this person was suddenly, locked out of their accounts. And it got pretty twisty pretty quickly. But I guess my point is not, not a partisan political statement here, but I kind of start to see, and we've seen as consumers, dealing with, the whole China, Russia versus US thing going on where we're saying, well, we don't want to use your stuff, that it doesn't necessarily have to be that level of an adversarial relationship if it's just, hey, we can't put all of our eggs in a basket that somebody else is carrying, basically.
Yes.
I kind of get that.
I 100% get it. Yeah, I really do.
They also did say, the politics, and the whole geopolitical thing is playing a role. But also, one of the things they shared is like the city of Copenhagen's Microsoft bill increased something like, 70 or 75% in just a few years. And it's, like over $53 million now.
There's always that money argument. I feel like I would love to see the EU sort of work on this problem, put some, investment and research into open source projects like LibreOffice. I feel like for the last 2 or 3 decades when, back in the days when Microsoft was the evil empire, there's been these long running movements to move everybody to Linux and let's get off the Microsoft suite and find your freedom and all that. And it never really happened. I don't know if it's going to happen here, but that impulse persists. And I think there's more than just the behavior of one bad corporation now at stake. There is a government in the United States that does seem openly hostile to its nominal allies. When you combine that with the vast powers that American corporations have in the EU, you could see some European governments being like, maybe we need an exit strategy.
I actually have an idea here. What happened to Lotus Notes?
Yeah. Is it just sitting there waiting?
Can we resurrect Lotus Notes? I'm kidding. Whoever's throwing stuff at me in your car right now, if you're driving, listen, I'm just kidding. I promise you I'm kidding. There are some things that are worse than Microsoft, believe it or not. But speaking of, now it's interesting because we actually have a whole thread of stories related to, digital sovereignty and sovereign cloud pushes. So just days after, several articles about, Denmark and parts of the EU seeking Microsoft alternatives, Microsoft magically announced that it's releasing a version of 365 to run on-prem.
On-prem. Okay.
Yeah.
On-prem meaning in my private data center or in an Azure cloud, but it's an Azure cloud on European soil? What do they mean?
They're calling it Microsoft 365 Local, and it would only run on Azure Local. So that would be your on-prem Azure infrastructure, your own infrastructure.
Okay. A server I can grab and run away with if I feel like I need to.
Yeah. So we all loved managing our own Exchange servers, right? So we're right back. We're right back where we started. Oh, no, I'm kidding. I know some people do want to run their own on-prem stuff. I'm over that part of my career. Like, I'm not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Microsoft 365 Local is a thing. I think it's, I don't know when it's coming out, probably later this year.
So this is part of that trying to address European worries about sovereignty?
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. And, maybe there are cases for, the federal government because, what was it last year and the year before? The volume of attacks against federal agencies and its users through and via the Microsoft platforms. Surely that did not go unnoticed.
Right. There's also a story here about EU trying to launch its own DNS infrastructure, or at least a resolution service.
Yeah, it looked pretty cool. So they're launching DNS for EU, which sounds like, so again, links in the show note here. The one we have here is from a HelpNet security article that's pretty robust, covers as well. But basically, there's the federal entity or like the government entity is spinning this up, but it's an opt-in sort of thing. So they're not making people use it. It's going to be available for, public sector, private sector, consumers, business, federal agencies, whatever. Whoever wants to use it is going to have access to this. It sounds like it's being kind of the project, kind of like we have the CVE database, led in part by MITRE and sponsored by the federal government. It sounds kind of like that model where there's a
public-private partnership,
a private entity that's, kind of taking some ownership, and the government in the EU is kind of like infusing some resources and some oomph behind it to get it going. And then it sounds like after its first year, it needs to be sustained by, industry to keep going. And it also sounds like there's different, I don't know if tiers is the right word. So let me call them security tiers, for lack of a better word, where you can choose to use their DNS service. Again, it's optional, just with DNS services, or you can start to layer on some filtering if you want to take advantage of their, like, let's say, known malicious, URLs, et cetera. So it sounds like there's some kind of opt-in to, you can kind of, choose your own adventure there if you want to use that platform. Yeah, so I think that sounds interesting. And I definitely think that we can all get behind the idea of, DNS security and getting better control over just DNS transactions in general.
Right, and there are regulations like GDPR that have requirements about data about Europeans needing to stay within like European boundaries, and so a more localized DNS infrastructure could presumably help with that.
Yeah.
All right, links in the show notes. We'll move on. Earlier in June, Google had a significant cloud outage, and JJ, you dug up some articles that dug into how that happened.
Yeah, more rabbit holes and shiny objects on this one. I did not understand the technical jargon at all, but basically my takeaway from it was they had, at the end of May, made some changes to code that was not in use. And then somewhere around June, parts of that code that did like quota checks and other API security functions accidentally got enabled, but with some null values. And, with all of the automation, those null values just broke everything. So then what it sounds like is they kind of, I think, fixed pretty much everything within a couple of hours. So it rolled out really quickly. That they have a system that just kind of syncs and pushes globally throughout all of their regions. So it propagated very quickly. Of course, they caught it quickly. And I think they had everybody, most regions back up in 2 hours. It sounds like maybe North America had such a backlog that it took a few hours to get all of that back up online. And it did sound like it was pretty broad. So it was the Google Cloud Platform and all of the services tied to that, like their IAM and storage, the Google Workspace app. So anybody using that G Suite for corporate purposes, or I guess even just Gmail for individual use. But then also like a pretty large set of third-party services that run on Google Cloud. So Spotify, Discord, Twitch, Snapchat, Fitbit, GitLab, all of that was impacted as well. So I think they did a really good job being very transparent about exactly what happened. And if you're a developer, you will probably follow along with their language much better than I did. So there's a status Cloud Google link that we have in the show note that details that, as well as a Thousand Eyes blog that did a pretty nice analysis. I liked that one because, again, not understanding, what all of the phrases mean from a, development standpoint, the Thousand Eyes I found pretty easy to follow.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Thousand Eyes blog now, and it is nice and clean. It also notes that it wasn't the network. And usually when you dig into the outage reports on these kind of big, broad outages, it tends to be BGP, some kind of fat fingering or a bad update. In this case, it sounds like it was some API errors that prevented Google's identity and access management system from being able to authenticate and validate services and users. And so that just shut everything else down. But yeah, Thousand Eyes does have a really nice write-up. Moving on, we got into some privacy stuff. Now we'll get into some copyright stuff. Disney and Universal are suing the AI firm Midjourney over alleged copyright infringements in Midjourney's use of copyrighted information. They're saying that they're alleging that Anthropic used those images without permission to train AI models.
Yeah, they kind of stole all of the characters that we love. Right? Star Wars, The Simpsons, all the little automobiles from Cars, Shrek. Breaking my heart the most, the Minions. I love those movies. I love the Minions.
Most of my contact with popular culture after like 2000 comes from what my kids were into, and they never really got into Despicable Me. So
Really?
yeah, I don't know why. They liked a lot of the other popular stuff, but
Mm. I don't watch movies more than once. Like, there's a very, very short list of movies I will watch more than once, and that one just
it spoke to you.
makes me laugh and giggle. Yeah, and any of the little shorts that have the minions in them, I just snort the whole time because I can't even breathe enough to laugh. I don't know.
Wow.
But easily amused? Who knows? I don't know. But yeah, they're some of my favorite little characters.
Hey, if something brings you joy, embrace it.
Yes. And every time I see a large stuffed animal, I'm like, it's so fluffy. But if you haven't seen the movie, you don't even know what that's from.
That's right. Just fast forward through this part. Yes. Yeah, so I think this is interesting. I will note that just recently, Meta and Anthropic prevailed in lawsuits brought by book authors who alleged copyright infringement. In the Meta case, the judge sided with Meta, although I will note the judge also said, quote, "This ruling does not stand for the proposition that Meta's use of copyrighted materials to train its language models is lawful. It stands only for the proposition that these plaintiffs made the wrong arguments and failed to develop a record in support of the right one." So in other words, the judge was like, you guys came to court, didn't have a good argument. I kind of agree with you, but your argument was bad, so I have to rule against you. But there are ways you could win in court. So maybe Disney and Universal will go down the right road on this one. We'll see.
Yeah. It is the first of its kind from Hollywood, basically.
Yes.
I think it will be interesting. Another one of those, I think, setting some precedent here.
And, frankly, I'm glad. I feel like the big AI companies are posing like, well, this is essential technology and we can't have any restrictions on what we do, whether that means like gobbling up copyrighted materials or not, because this is so essential that we just should be allowed to break laws or take advantage of people because, and that seems to me a wildly unfair proposition, particularly for multi-billion-dollar companies that could afford to pay copyright to access this stuff.
Yeah, true that. Let's hit a few more. We'll go quick through these last few here. But I did want to hit on the Salesforce thing because there was a long list from a researcher related to zero-day flaws, some flaws and some misconfiguration related to Salesforce that I think, I don't know, but I imagine probably a lot of our listeners work for organizations that use Salesforce or have to interact with it in some ways. I mean, even I don't use that in my, my company is, CRM or anything else, but I've definitely interacted with other organizations where they give you a Salesforce account to do certain things as a partner. So some interesting things here. Several CVEs came out of this, and one of them was, basically that things that were supposed to be encrypted weren't, and they were presented in clear text. There was another that had to do with the required permissions field basically comes from the client side. And so if you are the client side, you could basically just tell it whatever you wanted from a permissions and override the permission flag there. Then the view encrypted data that I just mentioned was not being enforced. So we were getting, clear text, plain text values for things that should have been encrypted. And, you guys know things that are in, CRM and tools that hook into accounting and other stuff, typically has some confidential information. And then the last one, well, not the last one, but the last one that I'm talking through here was a CVE that allowed guest users to access value for custom settings, which sounded very interesting. So
yes,
not secure. But it sounds like there were 5 CVEs. 3 of them got fixed and kind of recognized by Salesforce. 2 other of the CVEs require the customer to do some things. But then it sounds like there are about 16 more kind of configuration vulnerabilities or risk that the researcher found that don't have CVEs, but customers just need to find and address that. So we've got that link for you guys in the show notes.
Yeah, that's interesting because with a software as a service platform, I'd be like, well, CVEs are their problem, not mine. But it does sound like some of these actually did have steps that customers needed to take to remediate. So don't think this is not on you. You might want to go check that out if you are a Salesforce user.
Absolutely. So we did promise to talk about some vulnerabilities in printers, and I think we always have vulnerabilities in printers, so no big surprise here, but some researchers at Rapid7 found they're categorizing as 8 different vulnerabilities that are affecting, a lot of the headlines say brother brand, multifunction printers. However, it's actually a list of several manufacturers. I think I saw, Fujifilm, Ricoh, Toshiba, Konica Minolta. I was actually, at a government organization a couple weeks ago doing a on-site deployment, and they had, several of these printers in their environment, including at the police station and their healthcare organization. So these are prevalent and floating around out there. So 8 vulnerabilities. Oh, let's see. It says the most concerning was, it's actually a CVE from last year, that says it can be exploited by somebody knowing the device's serial number to generate the default administrator password. that particular one was from a Brother printer. They said they can't really fix that in firmware. They're changing that for manufacturing moving forward. There's some, manual intervention that the system administrators can do to, manually change passwords on those devices. But then there's, 7 specifically other high severity and medium severity vulnerabilities as well.
And I guess the issue here with printers is that I would probably want to patch them because they could be, sort of a land and expand entry for attackers.
I think printers are they're not the most, overlooked vulnerable thing in an infrastructure, but they are often overlooked. But if you think about the things that still, especially the things that still get printed now, they're usually, contracts, documents, things that we need to have a paper copy of. It could be, confidential personal information. So lots of sensitive stuff that gets stored in a printer, but also...
Oh, like cached inside the printer?
Yeah. And same thing if they're doing faxes, if they're receiving faxes or sending faxes, that's all cached there as well. Sometimes, they're also attached even to SharePoint and OneDrive. And almost always they're on a network that's, kind of considered a production internal secured network. So now you have an entry point. And, we've covered in past news episodes, some of the Run Zero reports and interesting research around devices on your network that are bridging and routing traffic that you don't expect them to. And printers are most definitely one of those things. So, I don't think this is let's run around with our hair on fire here, but I do think that any device that's attached to your network, especially on a privileged network, needs some attention. And I was actually reading a SANS summary from this. And one of the things they talked about was they had a red team. I don't know whose red team exercise this was, so I'm sorry. But one of the things the red team did was actually, get access to a printer inside of their target organization, make up this little flyer for free goodies targeted at specific users and printed them to the printer that was there inside of the company. And when something prints out of a printer that's inside of your building, it's got a QR code on it. You're going to go, well, obviously somebody here printed this and it's fine. And I'm going to scan that QR code. But, it was a red team exercise. So,
Because it looks like here the printout they sent had the QR code, but also some enticements like, click here to win some prizes or whatever for this company. It's company giveaway day.
Yeah, Acme Gizmo giveaway day. Get your free $50 gift certificate to some...
Get a free sandwich.
Yeah. So, yeah, they're calling it prishing, I guess, print phishing. So that's the thing. Oh, we've got threatening. We've got prishing. We are expanding our vocabulary. You're welcome, people. You are welcome. I'm so glad you get to enjoy this.
Be the first in your neighborhood to use the term prishing.
Prishing. Yep. Last couple little quick things, because we don't really like to cover just, everyday CVEs, but it is worth mentioning this one, that's Cisco ICE, and that's the Identity Services Engine, which is their, Radius, TechX Plus, NAC product, does have some maximum severity unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerabilities. So definitely check that out. This is new at the end of June 25th, 26th, these were announced. So if you're running ICE, you definitely want to be patching that.
Yep.
And not on our run sheet, but something I was going to mention quickly is kind of along the same lines. There's also a fake SonicWall VPN app floating out there that is malicious. So if you are downloading, installing, adding SonicWall VPN agent, make sure you're getting it from SonicWall.
Okay. Yeah, that's scary.
Not somewhere else.
Right.
And then lastly, there is a specific ransomware group that is exploiting a set of Fortinet vulnerabilities. So kind of your quick little roundup there of our network infrastructure being targeted right now, a little more time-based actionable items.
All right. Well, that wraps up our June news roundup. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Packet Protector. If there's a topic or something else you want us to talk about, let us know. Or if you have a comment, a correction, a question, you can reach out at packetpushers.net/FU. We do love when listeners reach out. And just to let you know, Packet Protector is part of the Packet Pushers podcast network. That network has a dozen technical podcasts, and actually we're adding 2 more coming soon for your professional development on networking, security, IPv6, DevOps, cloud, and more. There's our industry blog, 2 weekly newsletters. One of them is called Human Infrastructure. Check it out. A community Slack group, a YouTube channel, an IRC group. You can find it all at packetpushers.net, free with no login required. Thanks for listening.